I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I didn't realize just how far they'd go until I found my own driveway blocked by their so-called security patrol over a measly fine of $109. I pulled up to my house after a long shift, 15 hours on duty, coordinating with my officers, handling a robbery downtown, and then wrapping up paperwork that never seemed to end. I was aching for a hot shower and a quiet evening. Instead, I found a golf cart sitting dead center in my driveway, manned by two middle-aged guys in matching polo shirts with laminated HOA security badges hanging from lanyards. I sighed, rubbing my temple. I already knew who was behind this stunt. Sure enough, standing on my lawn with her arms crossed like she was about to issue a royal decree was Zelda Whitmore, the president of the Oakridge Estates HOA. Early 50s, blonde hair so stiff with hairspray it could survive a hurricane, and a permanent expression of disapproval. She had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved in. "Travis," she said my name like it was a bad taste in her mouth. "You're in violation." I leaned an elbow on my car window. "Oh yeah, what violation is that?" Her lips pressed together in a smug little line. "Unpaid fine, $109 due last Wednesday." I stared at her. "You blocked my driveway over $100. She lifted her chin. "We take violations very seriously here. HOA fees ensure property values remain stable, and delinquent payments cannot be tolerated. Your car stays out until the fine is paid." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Zelda moved the golf cart. "You can pay the fine first." I chuckled, but there wasn't any humor in it. "You really don't want to do this." She gave me the kind of look you give a child who just knocked over a vase. "And why is that?" The two guys in the golf cart shifted uncomfortably. I could tell neither of them had expected this to turn into a standoff. I stepped out of my cruiser and stood to my full height, watching as Zelda's confidence flickered just slightly. "Because I'm the chief of police, Zelda." Silence. One of the HOA rent-a-cops cleared his throat. Chief." I nodded. "That's right, Chief Travis Hayes." I turned back to Zelda. "Which means you're illegally blocking my driveway." I gestured toward my cruiser. "And obstructing an officer of the law." Zelda's face turned a fascinating shade of red. "This is purely an HOA matter. You're a resident here and—" I cut her off. "I'm also a sworn officer of the law, and you're interfering with my ability to access my own property." I nodded toward her security team. "And unless these two have actual security licenses, they're impersonating law enforcement, which is a crime in this state." The two men in the cart immediately paled. Zelda's jaw tightened. "This is absurd." I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the golf cart. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the city. You're abusing HOA authority, and I guarantee the city council won't like this." Zelda's confidence wavered, but she still refused to back down. "If you pay the fine, this will all go away." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "No, Zelda, this is just the beginning." The tension between us stretched thin, the silence pressing down on the so-called security officers still seated in the golf cart. One of them shifted uneasily, glancing toward Zelda as if waiting for her command. I could see the calculations flickering behind her eyes, but she was too proud to back down immediately. I took a measured step forward, making sure to keep my voice even. "Let me explain how this is going to go, Zelda. You're going to move that cart, and I'm going to document this incident. If I find out you've pulled something like this on anyone else in the neighborhood, I'll make sure the city council gets a full report." Her fingers twitched at her sides. She was balancing on the edge of defiance and self-preservation, but she wasn't stupid. She knew she'd gone too far, and if she pushed any harder, it wouldn't end well for her. One of the security guys cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. Maybe we should just move the cart." Zelda shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but she knew she was out of options. With a huff, she waved her hand dismissively. "Fine, move it." The two men scrambled to obey, rolling the golf cart back just enough for me to pull into my driveway. I didn't move immediately. Instead, I took out my phone again and snapped another picture, making sure to capture Zelda's expression of barely contained fury. "This is harassment," she muttered under her breath. I raised an eyebrow. "Harassment? That's rich coming from the person who just tried to hold my property hostage over a fine." She exhaled sharply, spinning on her heel and marching down the sidewalk. The two security guys hesitated before following, clearly eager to put some distance between themselves and the mess Zelda had just created. Once they were gone, I walked up my driveway, my mind already running through the next steps. This wasn't over. Zelda had just made a critical mistake. She'd exposed how far she was willing to push her authority. and now I had leverage. I stepped into my house and went straight to my office. My computer hummed to life as I plugged my phone in and transferred the photos I'd taken. Documentation was key. If Zelda wanted to play dirty, I'd make sure every one of her moves was tracked and recorded. After compiling my evidence, I placed a call to an old friend, Mark Lawson, a city council member who had been fighting against overreaching HOAs for years. When he picked up, his tone was casual but curious. "What's up, Travis? Didn't expect to hear from you this late." I leaned back in my chair. "Got a situation with the Oakridge HOA. Zelda Whitmore just tried to block my driveway over an unpaid fine." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "She actually blocked you in." "Had two of her guys park a golf cart right in my driveway. Said I couldn't park until I paid." Mark sighed. "That's a blatant abuse of power. She's been on our radar for a while, but this is actionable." I smiled faintly. "That's what I was hoping to hear. I've got pictures, timestamps, and a full account of what happened." "Send it over," Mark said immediately. "Zelda, been pushing her luck for too long. The council's already been getting complaints, but no one's had solid evidence. This might be what we need to start an investigation." I forwarded the files and leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was the first step in what was sure to be a battle, but I wasn't the type to back down. Zelda thought she could strong-arm people into submission, but she had just picked the wrong target. The next morning, I woke to an email from Mark. The city council was officially opening a review into the Oakridge HOA's enforcement practices. That alone was enough to put a dent in Zelda's unchecked power, but I knew better than to assume she'd back down quietly. By the time I stepped out to grab my morning paper, I wasn't surprised to find Zelda already waiting near the sidewalk, arms crossed tightly. Her expression was carefully composed, but I could see the tension in her posture. I took my time unfolding the paper before glancing up at her. "Something on your mind, Zelda?" She inhaled sharply. "I know what you did." I raised an eyebrow. "You'll have to be more specific." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You went to the city council." I didn't bother denying it. "That's right. You abused your authority and now you're under review. Actions have consequences." Her nostrils flared. "You think you can just waltz in here and undermine everything we've built? This community thrives on order, and I won't have you disrupting it." I chuckled. "Order, Zelda, what you're running is a dictatorship with flower beds, and you've been getting away with it because no one's fought back." Her expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Zelda, you did, and now you're going to have to answer for it." She turned sharply on her heel and stormed off, but I could tell this wasn't over. Zelda wasn't the type to accept defeat. She'd try to find another way to regain control, but this time I'd be ready. Later that evening, as I reviewed more HOA regulations, I stumbled upon something interesting: an old bylaw tucked away in the original community charter. It outlined that any HOA officer found guilty of abusing their power could be forcibly removed by a majority vote of the residents. A slow smile spread across my face. Zelda had spent years consolidating control, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd made too many enemies along the way. If I played this right, I wouldn't just stop her latest stunt. I'd take her down for good. I spent the next 2 days gathering more information. If I was going to take Zelda out of power, I needed to do it right. I combed through the HOA's governing documents, looking for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything that would reinforce my case. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. Zelda had been running the HOA like a personal kingdom, but she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. The original bylaws made it clear. If an HOA officer was found guilty of abuse of power, the residents could call for a vote of no confidence. If the majority agreed, that officer was immediately removed, no appeals. I wasn't the only one who'd had enough of Zelda's nonsense. Over the years, she had alienated plenty of homeowners with arbitrary rules, excessive fines, and underhanded tactics like the one she pulled on me. All I had to do was rally them. I started with my neighbor, Paul, a retired firefighter who had lived in the community for 2 decades. He wasn't a fan of Zelda either. When I showed him the bylaw, he let out a low chuckle and nodded. "She's been getting away with this for too long. I'll spread the word." Word traveled fast. By the end of the week, I had a small but growing group of homeowners ready to push back. We met in my backyard, away from prying eyes. As people shared their stories, it became clear just how deep Zelda's overreach had gone. One couple, Marcus and Renee, had been fined for having their trash bins out 5 minutes early. Another homeowner, Sarah, had been threatened with legal action for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Then there was Dave, who had been hit with a bogus violation for parking his truck in his own driveway despite the fact that it was well within regulations. Everyone had a story. Everyone was tired of Zelda's nonsense. I laid it out for them. The bylaw was clear. If we got enough signatures, we could force a vote. If the vote went in our favor, Zelda would be out. The energy in the group shifted. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood reclaiming their rights. Paul volunteered to help draft the petition. Sarah offered to go door to door. Within 24 hours, we had over half the neighborhood on board. Zelda must have caught wind that something was brewing, because the next afternoon she showed up unannounced. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, she marched straight up my driveway, her expression sharp. "I know what you're trying to do," she said. I didn't bother pretending. Good, that saves me the trouble of explaining it. Her jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. You're stirring up unnecessary conflict." I tilted my head slightly. "Conflict? You blocked my driveway over a minor fine. That wasn't conflict." She waved a hand dismissively. "That was enforcement." I folded my arms. "No, Zelda, that was abuse of power, and now the neighborhood is pushing back." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you can just waltz in here and turn people against me?" I let out a short laugh. "I didn't turn them against you, you did that yourself." For the first time, I saw something flicker in her expression, not anger, but uncertainty. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," she said, her voice quieter. I met her gaze. "I know exactly what I'm doing." She turned on her heel and stormed off, but I could tell she wasn't done. Zelda wasn't the type to go down without a fight. That night, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. Zelda claimed there was an unauthorized movement, attempting to undermine the stability of the community. She framed it as an attack on the integrity of the HOA and warned that reckless actions could lead to legal complications. It was classic fear-mongering, but it backfired. Instead of scaring people, it only made them angrier. By the end of the week, we had the required signatures. The petition was official. The vote was happening. When Zelda realized she couldn't stop it, she switched tactics. Suddenly, she was playing nice. She sent out a newsletter talking about the importance of community unity. She even tried to host a barbecue in the park, a last-ditch effort to win people over. It didn't work. The night of the vote, the turnout was massive. More people showed up than had ever attended an HOA meeting before. Zelda sat at the front, trying to maintain her usual air of authority, but I could see the cracks. She knew she was losing control. The vote was counted twice, just to be sure. 78% voted to remove her. It was over. Zelda stood up abruptly. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." Paul, standing beside me, shook his head. "No, Zelda, we're taking our neighborhood back." She stormed out without another word. The room erupted into cheers. People clapped each other on the back, shaking hands, celebrating. By the time I walked back home, I could finally breathe. Zelda had ruled with an iron fist for too long. Now the neighborhood was free. And from the looks of it, people were ready to make sure it stayed that way. With Zelda gone, the neighborhood had a strange quiet to it. The air felt lighter, the tension that had hung over Oakridge Estates for years finally lifting. People were talking more freely, laughing in their yards, and for the first time, there wasn't a sense of dread attached to opening an HOA notice in the mail. But I wasn't naive. Zelda might have been voted out, but that didn't mean she was done. People like her didn't just accept defeat, they plotted their way back. That's why I kept my guard up. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Paul knocked on my door just after sunrise, his expression tense. He held a stack of papers in one hand, and the moment I saw the HOA letterhead, I knew it wasn't good news. He handed me the top sheet. It was a formal request for an emergency review of the vote that had removed Zelda. The reasoning: procedural irregularities. I let out a slow breath, scanning the document. It was vague, intentionally so. No specifics, just an official-sounding claim that the process had been compromised. Paul crossed his arms. "She's trying to worm her way back in." I nodded. She must have called in favors. Someone inside the HOA board is still loyal to her. Marcus and Renee, the couple who had been fined over their trash bins, arrived a few minutes later, holding identical letters. Soon, more neighbors started showing up, all with the same document in hand. By noon, a crowd had gathered in my backyard, frustration brewing. Sarah shook her head, pacing. "This is ridiculous. We followed the rules," she lost. Dave, the guy who had been fined for parking his truck, ran a hand through his hair. She's got someone pulling strings. I set the letter down. We're not letting her steal this back. If she's claiming procedural issues, we'll prove her wrong. That meant going through every step of the process with a fine-tooth comb. We gathered all the original documents, the petition, the vote count, the attendance records. Paul and I spent hours double-checking everything, making sure there were no loose ends Zelda could exploit. Then I made a call to Mark Lawson, the city council member who had been keeping an eye on the HOA situation. He picked up on the first ring. I explained what was happening. Mark sighed. She's desperate, but she doesn't have legal ground unless there's actual evidence of misconduct. There isn't, I said. Then she's bluffing, Mark replied. She's hoping people will panic and let her back in. We weren't falling for it. That evening we called an emergency meeting of our own. The turnout was even bigger than the night of the vote. People were angry, not just about Zelda's latest stunt, but about the fact that the HOA board had even entertained it. Paul took the floor, holding up the original bylaws. We followed every rule. The vote was legal, the signatures were verified, and Zelda was removed by an overwhelming majority. Sarah stepped up next. If they're trying to reverse this without evidence, then they're the ones violating procedure. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Then the HOA board members arrived, all 5 of them. I wasn't surprised to see that 2 of them wouldn't meet my eyes. Those were Zelda's people. The other 3 looked uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be here but had been pressured into it. The board president, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. We've received concerns about the validity of the recall vote. Paul didn't let him finish. Concerns from who? Zelda, the same person we legally removed. Richard shifted on his feet. There's been a request for a formal review. I stood, then let's be clear who submitted it. Silence. Sarah folded her arms. If it wasn't Zelda, then who? One of the board members hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he admitted it came from an anonymous source. The crowd erupted. Marcus threw his hands up. That's not how this works. Renee shook her head. You can't overturn a legitimate vote because of an anonymous complaint. I stepped forward, and if you do, you open yourselves up to legal liability. Richard paled slightly. We were just reviewing. I cut him off. No, you're trying to undo the will of the community based on nothing, and if you push this, we'll take legal action. That got their attention. Paul held up the bylaws again. The only way to overturn a vote is if there is clear, documented misconduct. You have none. Richard exhaled, looking around the room. He saw what I saw, an entire neighborhood ready to fight back. Finally, he nodded. The review is canceled. A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. Sarah turned toward the board members still loyal to Zelda. And if you try this again, we'll vote you out too. The meeting ended with a standing ovation. Zelda had lost again. But I knew she wasn't done. The next morning, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. For a moment, I thought she was leaving for good. Then I noticed something else. 2 men in suits standing on her porch, deep in conversation. Something told me Zelda wasn't selling. She was plotting. And I wasn't about to let my guard down just yet. By the time the weekend rolled around, the for sale sign in Zelda's yard remained untouched. No realtor visits, no open houses, nothing. Just her, still living in that house, watching the neighborhood with the sharp gaze of someone who hadn't accepted defeat. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Paul stopped by that Saturday morning, his expression thoughtful as he leaned against my porch railing. She's up to something, he said, watching Zelda's house with narrowed eyes. She never planned on leaving. I nodded. She's waiting, probably trying to find a way back into power. Paul exhaled slowly. She's got too much pride to just walk away. People like her, they don't let go easily. Before I could respond, Sarah arrived, clutching her phone in one hand. Her usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with frustration. We've got a problem, she said, stepping onto the porch. I just got word from Renee Zelda's been talking to a lawyer. Paul frowned. For what? Sarah handed me her phone, where a text message from Renee was displayed. It was short but clear. Zelda met with an attorney. She's pushing to invalidate the vote, says it was improperly executed. I let out a slow breath. Of course she is. Sarah crossed her arms. She's claiming the ballots weren't counted properly, that there were irregularities. Paul scoffed, she's grasping at straws. I nodded, maybe, but we can't ignore it. If she finds a legal loophole, she might actually get traction. We needed to get ahead of this. That afternoon, I called Mark Lawson again. He wasn't surprised by the update. She's desperate, he said, but if she's bringing in a lawyer, you need to be ready. If she finds even the smallest procedural flaw, she'll exploit it. We reviewed everything again. The petition, the signatures, the vote totals. Everything was airtight. But Zelda wasn't working alone anymore, she had legal counsel, and that meant she wasn't just going to walk away quietly. Late that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a black SUV pulled up in front of Zelda's house. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. He didn't go to the front door, he went around to the backyard, out of sight. Paul, who had been sitting on his porch across the street, caught my eye and gestured toward the house. We both knew what this meant. Zelda wasn't just meeting with a lawyer, she was strategizing. The next morning, the first letter arrived. Delivered to nearly every household in the neighborhood, it was a formal notice challenging the legitimacy of the recall vote. It claimed the process had been conducted without proper oversight and that Zelda's removal was legally questionable. It was vague, full of legal jargon designed to intimidate homeowners, but the real kicker was the last line. Until this matter is resolved, Zelda Whitmore remains the rightful HOA president. People started calling me immediately. Marcus was furious. She's trying to act like the vote never happened. Sarah was livid. She's banking on people being too scared to fight this. We couldn't let that happen. That afternoon, we called another community meeting. It was held in Paul's backyard this time, away from prying eyes. Nearly 50 people showed up, all holding copies of Zelda's letter, all looking for answers. Renee shook her head. She's trying to bluff her way back in. Dave nodded. She's hoping people will just go along with it. I held up my own copy of the letter. She's got a lawyer now. That means she's serious. But here's the thing, she doesn't have the authority to overturn a legitimate vote just because she doesn't like the outcome. Paul leaned forward, so what do we do? I met his gaze. We fight back the right way. We get a lawyer of our own. A murmur went through the group. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You think we'll need to take this to court? Maybe, I admitted, but if we shut this down fast enough, she won't have a case to take that far. Mark had already given me a list of attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. That night, I made a call to one of them. By the next morning, we had legal representation of our own. The neighborhood pooled resources to cover the costs, and within 24 hours, a formal response was drafted and sent to Zelda's attorney. It was clear, direct, and left no room for argument. The recall vote was conducted legally, with full compliance to HOA bylaws. Zelda Whitmore was removed by the required majority. Any attempt to assume authority as HOA president would be considered fraudulent representation. Zelda's response came swiftly. Her lawyer sent a rebuttal, claiming the board had been manipulated into accepting the recall vote, that certain members had been pressured into supporting it. It was nonsense, but it was enough to drag things out. By the end of the week, tensions were rising. Then something unexpected happened. One of the board members who had initially supported Zelda flipped. Richard, the board president, showed up at my house one evening looking exhausted. She's out of control, he admitted. I thought she had a case, but all she's doing is throwing accusations around. She doesn't care about the rules, she just wants power back. That was the final crack in Zelda's foundation. With Richard turning against her, the remaining board members had no choice but to distance themselves. Paul and I drafted a new letter, signed by Richard, formally reaffirming the recall vote. It was sent out to every homeowner. Zelda had lost the last of her allies. By the end of the month, the for sale sign in front of her house was removed, and a moving truck showed up. She was leaving. People gathered on their porches, watching as Zelda packed up and drove away. No one waved. No one said goodbye. She had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist for too long, and now she was nothing more than a bad memory. As the sun set, Paul leaned against my porch railing, watching the tail lights disappear down the road. Well, he said, that was a fight. I nodded, but we won. Sarah grinned, and we made sure she'll never come back. The neighborhood had been through hell, but in the end, we stood our ground. And Zelda Whitmore. She was finally gone for good. With Zelda finally gone, the neighborhood took a collective breath. The control she had wielded for years had been shattered, and for the first time in a long while, people felt free. There were no more unnecessary fines, no more threats disguised as official notices, and no more fear of stepping out of line. But just because Zelda was gone didn't mean the work was over. Without her, the HOA was in disarray. The remaining board members were scrambling, some trying to salvage what was left of the organization, others looking for ways to distance themselves from the mess she had created. Richard, the former board president, had stepped down, unwilling to deal with the fallout. That left a leadership vacuum, and the neighborhood had to decide what came next. A meeting was called, this time in the community center rather than anyone's backyard. The turnout was even larger than before, with nearly every homeowner showing up. People were eager to have a say in what happened next. Paul stood near the front, arms crossed as he listened to the discussions. Sarah was seated beside Marcus and Renee, all of them engaged in quiet conversations with those around them. There was a sense of energy in the room, but also uncertainty. After a few minutes, I stepped forward. The noise quieted as people turned their attention to me. "We have a decision to make," I said. Zelda ran the HOA like a dictatorship, but with her gone, we have an opportunity to rebuild it into something that actually works for the community. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But that means we need leadership," I continued. "People who actually care about keeping this neighborhood a great place to live without abusing power." Paul raised a hand, "Or maybe we don't need an HOA at all." That sparked a debate. Some people wanted to scrap the HOA entirely, arguing that it had done more harm than good. Others believed that with the right leadership, it could serve its original purpose, maintaining common areas, organizing events, and handling legitimate concerns without overreach. Sarah stood, "If we get rid of it completely, we lose control over things like landscaping for shared spaces, the pool maintenance, and security for the park. There has to be a middle ground." A few people nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, still skeptical. Then Marcus spoke up. "What if we restructure it, keep the parts that actually benefit the community, but put in safeguards to make sure no one can ever pull what Zelda did again?" That seemed to get the most traction. I glanced around the room. That would mean rewriting the bylaws, putting in term limits, and creating a system where no one person has too much power. Sarah nodded, and making sure the board is accountable to the homeowners, not the other way around. It wasn't an easy decision, but after an hour of discussion, the majority agreed. The HOA would remain, but it would be rebuilt from the ground up. A transition team was formed, made up of volunteers who had been some of Zelda's loudest critics. Paul, Marcus, Sarah, and Renee all stepped up, along with a few others who had experience in finance, legal affairs, and community planning. Over the next few weeks, the bylaws were rewritten. The rules that had been weaponized under Zelda's reign were stripped away. New policies were put in place to prevent abuse of power. Homeowners would have more say, with open meetings and transparent decision-making. By the end of the process, the HOA was unrecognizable from what it had been before. And the difference was immediate. The constant stream of fines disappeared. People no longer had to worry about arbitrary enforcement of vague rules. Instead of fear, there was a sense of collaboration. Neighbors worked together on projects, from repainting the community center to organizing a block party. The first official meeting of the new HOA was held in the same community center, but this time the mood was different. There was laughter, real discussion, and a sense of relief. Paul leaned against the back wall, watching as people debated issues without hostility. "Feels different," he said. I nodded because it is. Sarah approached holding a stack of papers. "We just finalized the last of the amendments. No more unchecked power, no more secret meetings, and definitely no more Zelda." Marcus chuckled, thinks she's watching from wherever she ended up. Paul smirked, probably screaming into a pillow. We all laughed. For the first time in years, Oakridge Estates wasn't a place ruled by fear. It was just a neighborhood again. And that was exactly how it should be.